So what is the Immanuel Approach? Let me start with a really short summary. First, we apply several simple yet powerful biblical truths and brain science principles to help the recipient establish an interactive, two-way, back-and-forth connection with the Lord. And then second, once this interactive, two-way, back-and-forth connection has been established, we can pursue any one of a variety of options with respect to endeavors that God and the recipient can engage in together. For example, the recipient can just enjoy spending time with God. Or the recipient can ask God a very simple follow-up question. Is there anything else you have for me today, or that you want me to know today? Or the recipient can receive comfort from the Lord by talking directly with Jesus about anything that is distressing her and then receiving attunement from Jesus. That is, perceiving and feeling the truth that He is with her in her distress, that He is hearing her and understanding her, and that He cares about her and is glad to be with her. Or the recipient can engage in intercessory prayer in the context of the Immanuel Approach interactive connection. That is, she can focus on Jesus and just talk to Him directly regarding her intercessory prayer concerns. Or the recipient can do spiritual direction. She can focus on Jesus and engage with Him directly as if He is a spiritual director. He's actually a very good spiritual director. Or the recipient can do emotional healing work. She can go to a traumatic memory and then work with the Lord to resolve the trauma. Or the recipient can pick an issue or question regarding which she would like some help and then look at and think about the issue or question with God. And sometimes God comes up with ideas we haven't thought of. Now let me circle back and provide a bit more detail regarding the first part of the Immanuel Approach. The part where we, quote, apply several simple yet powerful biblical truths and brain science principles to help the recipient establish an interactive, two-way, back-and-forth connection with the Lord, end quote. The foundational biblical truths are particularly simple. God is always with us. God always wants to connect with us, and the average person can establish a two-way, interactive connection with God. The brain science principles for the initial steps in the Immanuel Approach process are also simple, but require just a bit more explanation. First, let me talk about relational circuits. God has created us to be relational beings, and to this purpose, God has created a big chunk of our brains to serve as the neurological hardware for running relationships. I call this part of our brains our relational circuits. And we can connect with each other and with God much more easily when these relational circuits are online and strongly active. A related and helpful bit of brain science is that recalling a positive memory and deliberately stirring up appreciation will predictably, consistently, reliably activate our relational circuits. That is, our brains are wired in such a way that feeling appreciation will bring our relational circuits online if they are off, and increase the intensity of their activity if they are already on. So, to be very practical, if we recall and think about a positive memory, and take the time to focus on and connect with the details, we will increasingly feel appreciation as we increasingly connect with the memory, and this will activate our relational circuits. Putting these pieces together, we can deliberately, predictably generate appreciation and activate our relational circuits by recalling and reconnecting with the positive memory. And this will prepare our brains to connect with God. Another piece of interesting, relevant, practical brain science is that our relationships are memory mapped. That is, our relationships with other people are carried in the memories for our past experiences with them. For example, I have thousands of memories of experiences with my wife, Charlotte, and our relationship is carried in these memories. If I deliberately recall, think about, and reconnect with these memories, this will activate the neurological circuits in my brain that carry my relationship with Charlotte, and thereby prepare my brain to connect with her in the present. In the same way, our relationships with God are memory mapped. Just as with other people, recalling, thinking about, and reconnecting with our memories for past positive experiences with God will activate the neurological circuits in our brains that carry our relationships with God, and thereby prepare our brains for connecting with God in the present. Therefore, if we have positive memories that include an experience of God's presence, then using these positive memories as the context for stirring up appreciation will be especially effective in preparing our brains for connecting with God. Note, memories that include a connection with God are ideal and optimal, but for those who do not yet have God-positive memories, other positive memories will still work. Yet another piece of interesting, relevant, practical brain science is that our brains are designed to work best in community. Actually, there are a number of ways in which our brains have been designed to work best in community, but the piece that is most relevant for the Immanuel Approach process is that our brains are more able to feel the importance and understand the meaning of our mental content when we describe it out loud to another person. These benefits will help us to perceive God's presence by helping us to feel the importance and recognize the meaning of subtle manifestations of His presence that we might otherwise miss. And these benefits will help us to connect with God by helping us to feel the importance and recognize the meaning of subtle interactive content coming from the Lord that we might otherwise miss. Therefore, putting all of these biblical truths and brain science principles together, if we coach recipients to re-enter the memory for a previous experience of connecting with God, coach them to deliberately stir up appreciation in the context of this positive memory, coach them to invite God to be with them and to help them establish a connection, and coach them to describe whatever comes into their awareness, most recipients will reliably, predictably, consistently perceive God's presence and be able to establish an interactive, two-way, back and forth connection with Him. And again, if you do not have memories for previous experiences of connecting with God, any positive memory will work for beginning the process. Another new and important feature of the Immanuel Approach is that it has safety nets. The initial steps of recalling a positive memory, deliberately stirring up appreciation, and establishing an interactive connection with the Lord all come together to set up an especially reliable home base that we can use as a backup or safety net troubleshooting resource. That is, if we encounter any difficulties that we are not able to handle with other troubleshooting resources, we can just coach the recipient to go back to the positive memory, appreciation, and interactive connection from the beginning of the session. And then in that safe, positive context, we can coach the recipient to engage directly with God and ask God for guidance and help regarding the problem. Again, we can help the recipient get back to his home base and then coach him to get help directly from the Lord in this safe, positive context at any point we encounter difficulties that we don't know how to handle. This especially reliable home base that gets set up at the beginning of each session also provides a make sure the recipient is okay safety net for the end of emotional healing sessions. If we are approaching the end of an emotional healing session and the recipient is still connected to negative emotions from a traumatic memory, either because the process has gotten stuck and we have not yet been able to resolve the blockage, or because there's just a lot of healing work to do and we simply don't have enough time, we can just coach the recipient to go back to the positive memory, appreciation, and connection with the Lord that were all refreshed and put in place at the beginning of the session. The recipient may be disappointed that he was not able to resolve the traumatic memories, but he will at least end up back at a safe place of relational connection and positive emotions. Emmanuel intervention troubleshooting is discussed in much more detail in the Big Lion book and in segment number 4 of the basic training videos. But for the purposes of this introduction, here is a very, very short summary. First, the Lord is always with us. The Lord has been present with us in every past experience, and the Lord is present with us now. And second, the Lord always wants to establish an interactive connection with us. The Lord always wants us to be able to perceive His presence, connect with Him, synchronize with Him, interact with Him, receive from Him, and be with Him. Therefore, if the recipient is not initially able to establish an interactive connection, it just means that there are blockages in the way. Furthermore, these blockages can almost always be identified and resolved. So we work very persistently to expose and resolve any blockages, and in almost every situation, persistent troubleshooting eventually enables the recipient to perceive God and to experience a two-way interactive connection with His tangible, personal, living presence. Number 5. The source of psychological trauma, the process for resolving psychological trauma, and Immanuel Approach emotional healing. This material regarding psychological trauma will be presented in much greater detail in training segments 10 and 11. But for the purposes of this introduction, I want to just briefly touch on the brain science with respect to the source of psychological trauma, the brain science with respect to resolving psychological trauma, and the Immanuel Approach for resolving psychological trauma. Let us begin with the pain processing pathway. When we encounter pain, our brain-mind-spirit system always tries to process the painful experience. There is a specific pathway that this processing attempt will follow, and there are specific processing tasks that we must complete as we travel along this pathway, such as maintaining organized attachment, staying connected to the event, that is, not dissociating, staying connected to God and people, that is, staying relational, navigating the situation in a satisfying way, and correctly interpreting the meaning of the experience. When we are able to successfully complete this processing journey, we get through the painful experience without being traumatized. We emotionally and cognitively metabolize the experience in a healthy way, and instead of having any toxic power in our lives, the successfully processed painful experience contributes to our knowledge, skills, empathy, wisdom, and maturity. That is, when we successfully process a painful experience, we don't just stuff it down into our unconscious or teach ourselves to think about other things. We actually come out the other side stronger and wiser as opposed to wounded. So now I would like to talk about the source of psychological trauma. Unfortunately, various problems and/or limitations can block successful processing, and when we are not able to complete the processing journey, then the painful experience becomes a traumatic experience, and the memory for this traumatic experience will carry unresolved toxic content. This has very practical implications for our day-to-day lives, because every time something in the present activates or triggers a traumatic memory, the unresolved toxic content comes out of where it's stored and becomes part of what the person thinks and feels in the present. And this coming forward of traumatic memory content into the present causes a host of different problems. So now let's talk about the good news, resolving psychological trauma. The good news about the pain processing pathway and psychological trauma is that traumatic memories can be resolved. If I find a traumatic memory and connect with it, if I set up the right conditions so that the memory file can be modified, And if I complete the remedial processing tasks that I was not able to get through successfully at the time of the original painful experience, then the traumatic content will be permanently resolved, and the memory previously known as traumatic will be transformed into one of the experiences that contribute to my knowledge, skills, empathy, wisdom, and maturity. The bad news is that this work to resolve traumatic memories can sometimes be complicated and difficult. However, Immanuel Approach emotional healing provides more good news. The Lord knows all about the pain processing pathway. He knows all about how to work with traumatic memories, and He really, really wants to help us get healed. When we do Immanuel Approach emotional healing work, we help the recipient establish the interactive connection with God that serves as the foundation for the session, and then we coach the recipient to engage directly with God as the primary therapist. When the recipient is able to establish and maintain a strong connection with the Lord, as you will see in the demonstrations for training segments 10 and 11, then God does all of the heavy lifting, and the whole process can be amazingly simple. The most straightforward Immanuel Approach process for emotional healing is to first set up the safety net home base and refresh the recipient's connection with God by helping her to establish an interactive connection in the context of a positive memory. And then help the recipient to get inside one of her traumatic memories, help her to connect with God inside the traumatic memory, and then help her to work with God inside the traumatic memory to finish the necessary processing tasks. Finally, I want to talk about the primary objective, the most important goal for the whole Immanuel Approach endeavor, that is, increased intimacy with Jesus. And I want to talk about the Immanuel Approach lifestyle. As described in much more detail in Chapter 3 of the Big Lion book, I started my journey with the Immanuel Approach believing that the primary objective was to heal psychological trauma in order to relieve suffering. As also described in this same chapter, this initial perspective started to change when Jesus told one of my clients, "I love my children, and I am glad to free them from suffering. But the primary, most important purpose of all this emotional healing stuff is to remove the blockages that are between your heart and me. The primary, most important purpose of emotional healing is to remove the blockages that hinder your heart from coming to me." When my client reported these words from Jesus, I immediately realized that this is an important truth with respect to emotional healing. And then as I continued to ponder these words from the Lord, I increasingly realized that this intimacy priority component of the Immanuel Approach applies to much more than just the ways in which emotional healing resolves blockages that hinder our hearts from coming to Jesus. The very short summary is that there are many components of the Immanuel Approach that inherently prioritize our connection and intimacy with God. Furthermore, when we work these components of the Immanuel Approach into our lifestyles, as skills that we regularly practice, and as behaviors that we build into our daily lives as habits, we will build an Immanuel Approach lifestyle that especially prioritizes and facilitates intimacy with the Lord. As I was talking with a young missionary about her experience with the Immanuel Approach, she spontaneously commented, "I started using the Immanuel Approach to get healing, but what I found was intimacy." I have heard essentially this same comment from many others who have embraced the Immanuel Approach as a lifestyle, and this has also been my own experience. I believe that this is the predictable result of the many ways in which the Immanuel Approach inherently prioritizes intimacy with Jesus. May you be blessed to use these principles and tools to experience the wonderful, wise, tangible, living, loving, life-giving, interactive friendship presence of God.